Pleasure now to introduce Victoria Lorrimar. Victoria is University of Oxford Faculty of Theology and Religion. She's a DPhil student. Pleasure to have you. Thank you very much. She's going to be talking about mind uploading and the importance of the human body for intelligence. Victoria, over to you.
Thank you. And I just want to clarify before I begin that I'm talking a lot about mind uploading, but I think some of the questions that come up also apply to some more general AI concepts. So Robert also helpfully introduced us to lots of the themes of mind uploading, so that will help as background for this. So I really want to argue that the idea of the transhuman has captured the public imagination. It's no longer really cloistered in the elite circles of sci-fi or of sci-fi fandom. And one reason for this is that just last month, Gucci, if you would believe it, launched a fashion show that was named Cyborg. And it was described by Vogue as a procession of transhumans, walking in trance-like step through a suite of operating theatres. Bolted together from the clothing of many cultures, they were a metaphor for how people today construct their identities. A population undergoing self-regeneration through the powers of tech, Hollywood, Instagram, and Gucci. So we are the Dr. Frankenstein of our lives, head designer Alessandro Michel is quoted as saying. He said that we exist to reproduce ourselves, but we have moved on. We are in a post-human era. For sure, it's underway. And he was apparently inspired by his reading of the feminist philosopher Donna Haraway, her 1984 A Cyborg Manifesto, Science, Technology, and Socialist Feminism in the late 20th century. So I think when fashion giants start batting around terms like post-human and cyborg, we can safely say that these concepts have pretty well infused the public imagination. Now, I'm not the most fashion-forward of people, but I do want to just quibble a bit with Vogue's description. I want to say I think they got it a little bit wrong when they described the show as a procession of transhumans. I'd say post-human is much more accurate, although I won't get into the differences now. But why am I rejecting this transhumanist conception and association in the context of fashion? Why does it matter? I think because the fashion industry is inescapably corporeal. So clothing highlights the body, or perhaps the body highlights the clothing. Either way, the body is definitely central in the fashion industry. But in certain spheres of transhumanist thought, not all, but in certain spheres, and in AI enthusiasm, the body isn't really as valued. So we see this in ideas like mind uploading. So we were introduced to Hans Moravec before, the former director of robotics at Carnegie Mellon University, and he's also spent a lot of time working for NASA and the military developing advanced robots. And he was really the first scientist to seriously propose the idea of living perpetually through a digital substrate. So in his work, Mind Children, that we heard about, he envisioned a procedure in which the entirety of the information encoded with the neurons of a human brain could be read, like not just scanned as Kurzweil would have it, but chopped up and read, and then copied and uploaded to a computer. So rather than a radical extension of biological life, this is looking for immortality through a software existence. And Ray Kurzweil, as well, another transhumanist advocate, considers mind uploading to be a likely scenario. It's one of his predictions, saying that at some point in the future, we will, quote, have effectively uploaded ourselves, albeit gradually, and never quite noticing the transfer. So apart from increased longevity, mind uploading pursues goals of greater intelligence. It escapes the limitations of the biological and degenerating brain. You can back up personal identity and memories. The uploaded mind could also, of course, benefit from running on a more efficient compiler. So Moravec captures the prevailing attitude towards the body that we see in proponents of mind uploading by defining human being as the pattern and the process that's going on in my head and body. So not the machinery that's supporting that process. If the process is preserved, I am preserved, and the rest is mere jelly. So this vision obviously relies on a materialistic understanding of the self, something that can allow replication on a computer model, And it's common for uploaders to use the language of information technology, so that's why I'm using scare quotes here, when they describe the human brain. We also see a similar view of the body in some elements of science fiction. So when Case, who is the protagonist in Neuromancer, describes the biological body when it's unaugmented and when it's disconnected from cyberspace, he describes it as meat. And I think this sounds quite a lot like the mere jelly of transhumanists. And Mark Derry sums up this attitude to the flesh that we see in both cyberpunk fiction and also in proposals for mind uploading. And he says it's the body's job to be a symbol of detestable putridity in the eyes of an information society characterised by an exaltation of mind and a contempt for matter. Most of all, the body, that ageing, earthbound relic of Darwinian evolution that net junkies refer to as meat. So this disdain for the body isn't just reflected in these ideas of bodily augmentation, but also in fiction in terms of mind uploading as well, more extreme. If you're ever interested, Richard Stallman has written a short story that you could even classify it as a utopia, and he writes about a human sort of gradually shifting his more and more of his existence onto a virtual platform as his relationship with a virtual soulmate progresses. So she sort of convinces him over time, like, oh, if you just upgraded yourself a little, like we'd have such a good relationship. And over time he does this and apparently experiences a fuller joy that he ever could have imagined once this upload is complete. So we have certain streams of thought in which the biological body is derided as meat or as mere jelly, as something that should be discarded, either in favour of something more robust, a more robust physical body, or perhaps even no body. So whether we're talking about uploading our own minds to a digital substrate, or whether we're talking about developing a general artificial intelligence, we might want to think some more about what the body brings to the table, so to speak, when it comes to intelligence. So one place to go for this is looking at the neuroscience of metaphor. And George Lakoff and Mark Johnson are two big researchers in this area, and they really highlight the embodied nature of cognition and of the way we communicate. So in their big work called Metaphors We Live By, they demonstrate from a range of research perspectives that metaphor operates unconsciously. It operates at the level of concept, not just of language, and it's fundamentally embodied. And they summarise one aspect of metaphor in understanding that we can't really articulate just with language. So they say that our metaphors will reflect our commonplace experiences in the world. And inevitably, many primary metaphors are universal, so they don't just depend on specific languages, because everybody has basically the same kind of bodies and brains and lives in basically the same kinds of environments. Ian McGilchrist, who's a psychologist and academic, also highlights the embodiment and the foundational nature of metaphor as well, saying it's the only way in which understanding can reach outside the systems of signs to life itself. He, quote, everything has to be expressed in terms of something else, and those something else's eventually have to come back to the body. So a few examples might help unpack this. There are examples that are quite well known in the field of metaphor and embodied cognition, and they really illustrate how our bodily relation to the world is embedded in the very language that we use. So take the idea that affection is warmth. When we give and we receive affection through physical contact, we are warmed, and this experience, change of temperature, is something that echoes in our language. So we don't literally interpret statements such as, she gave me the cold shoulder, or we received a warm welcome. And then it gets complicated because actually more than one physical experience can be associated with a concept. So in terms of affection, we might also relate it to proximity. We say things like, we're very close, or he's been distant lately. And these are things that we understand without interpreting them literally. Or we have the common metaphor that more is up is more. And we apply it to all kinds of abstract concepts. So our bank balances hopefully increase, the stock market plummets. These are things that are in our everyday language. And really they're abstractions, but they're derived from a more direct physical experience. Because if we fill a glass with water, we see the level rise, and we know that there's a correlation between height and volume. So Lakoff and Johnson look at a range of common concepts like these, and they show that time and time again, abstract concepts are arising from like a metaphorical projection, from a more directly embodied cognition concept. And this is kind of investigated from different angles. So we see it in phenomenology studies, and yeah, without getting into all of them, really people are arguing that the work of reason and of imagination and intuition, so all these different components of cognition, are all things that depend on a bodily experience that's somewhat shared among all people. So I think it's fair to say that from these perspectives, mind-body dualism has been challenged convincingly on a number of fronts, to the extent that it's a pretty hackneyed critique by now. But hackneyed or not, I think it's a critique that keeps coming up in intelligence studies. So Anne Catherine Hales recounts the story of how information lost its body, how it came to be conceptualized as an entity separate from the material forms in which it's thought to be embedded. But given that our capacity to know and to understand and to communicate is bound up in our embodied existence, the more radical proposals of mind uploading kind of bring up some concerns for us. So what would jettisoning the body do to our ability to make sense of the world? And it also raises questions as to like other aspects of transhumanism as well, things like radical morphological freedom. What does changing our body in really extreme ways by using enhancing technologies, how might that impact our present ability to comprehend the world and the other? And Hales raises a similar critique of mind uploading when she responds to Moravec's Mind Children. She says, how, I asked myself, was it possible for someone of Moravec's obvious intelligence to believe that mind could be separated from body? Even assuming such a separation was possible, how could anyone think that consciousness in an entirely different medium would remain unchanged, as if it had no connection with embodiment? Shocked into awareness, I began to notice he was far from alone. And it's not something that's completely ignored in transhumanist circles. So advocates of mind uploading have recognised concerns and the importance of the body. Kurzweil argues that a reinstantiated mind will need a body, since so much of our thinking is directed toward physical needs and desires. And his solution is to imagine a virtual human body, a body 2.0, he calls it. Nick Bostrom makes a similar case. He suggests we'll need to use simulated bodies that can permit uploads to experience the same kind of sensations as a regular human body via virtual reality. And then we have ideas of extended cognition, which are things that are really already operating. So we already augment our minds with tools and with other devices, and you can argue that they're an extension of a process that's going on inside our bodies. So the plasticity of the brain and its relationship with the body already allows for sort of new forms and stretching of what embodiment looks like now. Andy Clark describes the human self as a constantly negotiable collection of resources, easily able to straddle and to crisscross the boundaries between biology and artifact. So this agent-world boundary is reconfigurable. Human-machine interfaces are the outworking of a plasticity that's inherent, that's biological, and it's something that humans have always enjoyed. So this isn't some new thing. But actually I want to say that I already talked about how imagination is part of cognition, and the very reality that our imaginations are already embedded in being embodied, and they're tethered to our bodily existence and the way we relate to the world, means we might not even really be capable of meaningfully imagining a different way of being. So perhaps we're kind of limited in that way. And I think actually it's perhaps not trivial that fictional uploaded minds tend to still adopt virtual bodies of some sort. So I was asking a question before, and if anyone could think of an example, I'd be really grateful. But I can't think of any first-person characters in science fiction that don't have any kind of body, like some kind of virtual reality. So if people can hit me later with an example, that would be really helpful. But what it means is a lot of this, I think, is speculative by necessity, because we don't really have the tools to get past our own embodiment to think what could be different. So we've mainly been focusing on how our bodily existence affects the way we think and the way that we make sense of the world. And the metaphors that I was giving as examples are linguistic ones. But of course, the way that we communicate also relies on these linguistic patterns. But then we also have the added dimension of all the non-verbal components of communication, like gesturing and body language. And I think actually a lot of our reflection on artificial intelligence and communication has focused on these more obvious physical components as some of the potential difficulties. So the examples I gave, like more is up and affection is warmth, might seem relatively straightforward. Perhaps we could just program them into AI, or AI can learn their meaning as they're exposed to their use. But cognition and language continue to evolve, and new metaphors can always develop, particularly as we have different embodied experiences. And I think we see this emerging with certain technologies already. So metaphorical constructions like swipe left, for example, are sort of entering into common vocabulary in certain contexts. So what am I saying? Like most theologians, I think it's easier to take the apophatic approach and say what I'm not saying and say what isn't true. Although I'm talking about AI and mind uploading, not God. But what I'm not doing is commenting on the technological plausibility of general versus specific AI. I'm not trying to offer an apocalyptic warning of some doomed AI future. But I do want to say that the way we think about the relationship between intelligence and the body brings up questions that just really need to be thought through. And essentially these questions centre around what happens to bodies when we pursue these hypothetical scenarios of both uploading our own minds, which presumably won't remain restricted to our current processing capacities, or developing some kind of general AI. So just some of those questions are thinking about which intelligence. So is artificial intelligence aimed at simulating human intelligence? And I think perhaps not all the time, but I do think generally in AI research, we've kind of taken human intelligence as the template, as what we want to at least simulate. But how do we, as I've kind of mentioned before, as humans even conceive sufficiently of a different kind of intelligence, something that's foreign to our own way of defining intelligence? And then if we could think of that, could some kind of disembodied intelligence be better? Again, it's purely speculation. It's something we might have to try ourselves and see. But it is something we need to consider of what might we lose if we move further away from our present bodily relationship to the world outside of us, what happens to our intuitive ability, to our shared language and our understanding. But then on the flip side, new ways of occupying the physical world can enrich our metaphorical understanding and thought processes in ways that are unforeseen right now. And finally, in terms of communication, can there actually be adequate communication between embodied beings and non-embodied, disembodied intelligence? And this sort of throws us into the swampy territory of strong versus weak AI, or of whether the Turing test is valid or the Chinese room argument. And there are a lot of debates in AI research and the cognitive sciences around this. But I think they're focused more on whether a computer can either simulate or possess a human mind. And what I'm suggesting is that whatever kind of mind a computer might lay claim to, it can't really be a human mind, because human minds come in human bodies. So the question really is more along the lines of whether human minds and computer minds can find a common way of communicating and understanding, given that they inhabit the same world in very different physical configurations. So all the subtleties of human-to-human communication, many of which operate at intuitive levels and instinctive levels, are at the very least complicated when we start sort of playing around with alternate morphologies or some kind of disembodied existence. And it's a much bigger communication gap than those that are already in place due to language barriers or cultural barriers. And there's a lot that I haven't really touched on. So of course, We don't even now share a common bodily experience. Studies in gender and in disability have already challenged us to consider how different bodies shape different perspectives and ultimately produce different realities for the people in them. And they can expose the ways in which particular types of bodies are treated as normative, as well as sort of dominant representations of like technology as cure. So I think the way in which ideal types of the human are encoded in the technologies that we develop have to be examined critically. And we still have a lot to learn, therefore, when it comes to present embodiment. But I think these discourses at the margins offer a much more concrete engagement with varied embodiment than the abstraction that you find in a lot of AI research and cognitive sciences. So they're at least a starting point to think, how might we consider different ways of inhabiting the world? So in summary, I'm arguing that bodies matter, that they're fundamental to the way that we make sense of the world, that they provide much of the scaffolding on which a shared understanding and experience is based that allows us to meaningfully communicate with other people. But of course, we're also creative and ingenuous and adaptive beings, and surely we can develop new ways of knowing and communicating as embodiment evolves. But I just want to reiterate that these are questions we ought to be thinking about when we contemplate future possibilities, both AI and human. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions for Victoria, please? No questions? I know.
Thank you very much. So I had a couple of thoughts, but I'll only ask one. I'm not close enough.
Oh, let me just check that it's use that one.
Only one microphone. And I was curious from a theological perspective if you could comment on theological metaphors and how easily those might be shiftable. I mean, we don't talk about swiping left or right when we consider, say, people changing religions. So we don't transition that metaphor to God very easily, right, or the gods. So what kind of adaptability is there in theological reasoning to create new kinds of metaphors?
I think that gets trickier because, I mean, I mentioned a bit flippantly the apophatic thing, but a lot of theology is saying that our language is insufficient to describe the reality that is God. So I think as a theologian, I'd already want to acknowledge that gap and be unapologetic about it. But I think we'll hear more probably tomorrow from Beth on this, but a lot of the language that we use around technology is religious language. So these metaphors, theological metaphors, are already very transferable. I wouldn't be entirely surprised if ideas of swipe left and right get applied to religious concepts at some point, because I think language is just fluid in that way.
Other questions? No? Nobody? Okay, Victoria.